the admission webhook API. Joe Beta had suggested talking about it here. Then there was an issue that was opened. There's not clear agreement on the poll one way or the other. There's actually now two polls, both by Walter. I think it's worth discussing and deciding which direction we're going to go.
I don't think we should discuss it unless all the participants are here.
And I see Daniel will still be asleep, wouldn't he? Well, I mean,
yes.
Not asleep, but not in.
I think it's worth us taking a look at, and we discussed this last time, at sort of office hours and sort of that cadence of office hours versus regular meetings. I'm not sure that it makes sense to, like, we haven't seen the uptake yet on office hours, and we have a bunch of other business that we really need to take care of. One of the things that we decided last week was that if we don't have any items for office hours, we'll turn it into a working session around a specific topic. Now, we can go ahead and do that right now. I do think that there is some urgency around some of the issues around both API review and sort of how are we going to, how does SIG architecture relate to the API review process is one thing. And then specifically around the idea of, like, what is the form and format of webhooks and how does that apply to both the admission controllers and these new this new gRPC interface coming from the secret encryption APIs that are being generated, which again is kind of webhooky type of thing. So we're introducing, going into 1.9, we're introducing two new forms of call out from the API.
We already have gRPC interfaces for plugins, so that ship has sailed.
Well, not from the API server, have we?
From Kubelet, at least.
I know, and so, like, having Kubelet have one set of extensions is one thing. Having Kube Control have its own set of extensions is one thing. I think there's already a certain amount of inconsistency between the Kubelet and the API server just based on the roles that they play. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily a bad thing, but it's one of these things where we should go in eyes open, because we are introducing a new way to extend the API server that hasn't existed before.
I agree that we should do it. Whatever we do, it should be deliberately, not by accident. Yes.
And I think part of that is, I'm trying to find a thread that I have here. But anyways, I think, one part of this is that I don't see, and maybe I'm just not tied into the right loops, but I don't see a record of what are the API decisions that we're taking up, where were they discussed, how are we applying this consistently. It seems to be that a lot of these discussions are happening off list, outside of a SIG, outside of something that's actually tracked, or if they're happening inside a SIG, it's very much a parachute in type of thing, and it's very difficult to actually get the scope of what's going on with respect to our API.
Well, I think a lot of it has just been in GitHub in the past. So I think there does need to be a concerted effort to document generalizable decisions in the API conventions. I've asked that to be done in the past, and it usually hasn't happened. So we probably need to gate closure of issues on making sure that those types of things actually get documented. So I have that. Let's not discuss it in depth right now, but I did put the API reviews on the agenda. So just hopefully we can quickly knock something out. So how to engage with SIG architecture. I think there are issues that people want to ask us about, but they just use GitHub notifications or Slack, and I don't see them for about a week, in some cases a month, when I clean out my email. So,
well, but I mean, also to keep in mind here, this is more than just you, Brian. I mean, like,
yes.
I mean, you're a critical part of the project, but the architectural decisions are not vested in a single person, and that's something
that's true. But
we got to find a way to scale you out to some degree, right? Otherwise,
I agree. I think that's why this stuff needs to get documented. We need to make more progress on documenting the conventions. You called it case law, I think. I'm totally in favor of that. But not only did I not notice it, but apparently nobody else responded either. So, and I'm not the only one in these lists or on the Slack channel or things like that. So clearly things are not getting sufficient visibility. So I think we need to more strongly communicate that people need to add things to the SIG architecture agenda, or actually send email to the SIG architecture mailing list, which I can filter more sanely than general GitHub stuff.
I'm going to take an action item to send an email to Kubernetes dev, like just reminding everybody that, and also CC leads to say, here's SIG architecture, here's what we do. Like, I know we presented in the community meeting, but you might have missed it, and just get people online with that. And I think another aspect is that we don't have a decision-making hierarchy. We don't know who our tech leads are. I mean, we kind of do. I mean, Brian, obviously, you're one. Joe's one. And, Jordan and Clayton. But we don't really have any kind of consensus or decision-making format. So it makes me reluctant to jump in and say something, because I want to make sure that we're actually in alignment around what gets said.
Yeah. So we do have a documented concrete list of API approvers, and it includes 5 people today, which have had a lot amount of involvement with a lot of Kubernetes APIs. I think much like we've made efforts to expand the reviewer and approver pools for other parts of the project, we should try to do so here as well. But that's going to require, the documentation I mentioned before, as well as mentoring and things like that. So I think we should follow that. We do have more or less the reviewer approver pattern. We also have some amount of SIG coverage, because Clayton, Tim, Eric, Jordan, and I have been involved in many of the SIGs. And we try to let the SIGs, somebody from the SIG, individual SIGs, do the first line design and review before final approval. But I do think, and we're jumping kind of ahead into the API approval process. Part of that process will be to delegate and assign approvers and reviewers for specific API issues. We've also discussed doing some design reviews. I don't think we can do it for every single field change, for example, but we may want to do it certainly for totally new API mechanisms, or cutting new ground on API conventions or escalations where people cannot agree, and things of that nature. We might also want to have a formal set of criteria for going to beta and GA, things like that.
So I do want to bring up, so Brian, the idea of concentrating on the approvers and the approval process is important. I think it's also really important that we actually concentrate on the communication process around this, right? Yeah. I think there's a ton of folks who, like being able to watch where the API changes are incredibly highly leveraged in terms of understanding where the priorities and where the changes are in the project in general, right? It's like, when I was talking to a really successful tech lead at Google, I'm like, how the hell do you manage a team and like keep track of what's going on across this thing and be tech lead and a manager? And he's like, I don't do code reviews anymore, but what I do review is every API, every change to a proto file, right? And so that ends up being the place to actually sort of really see what's going on in the project. So again, I don't think that the approval process is as much of the problem, and there's probably stuff to be improved there, as much as the communication process around this. We really need to be able to have people sort of mind meld and understand where things are going and how we're applying these rules and these conventions. And I don't think that there's a way for people who are not sort of monitoring every SIG,
So that's the reason that I had tried to set up the sharded GitHub teams. So it might be possible to subscribe to API reviews from all the SIGs. That hasn't really worked out. It relies too much on humans to notify the right list, and filtering has been hard.
So one thing that would be really concrete that we could probably put in place very soon is we actually should do an official release API review when code freeze happens.
I like that.
Go through the changes that happen to the APIs. Because I know Jordan has done a little bit of this, and I've done a little bit of this, but it would be good to say, let's take one of the SIG architecture calls, or take a time slot and say, we are going to, as part of our release process, do a review of all the APIs that got added in 1.9 any API review after this point must go through this process, and start putting that as part of the release process. That seems very reasonable and a concrete thing we can practice, like starting next week or week after.
So this is some good stuff is being discussed here. Could we actually get a volunteer to take notes?
I was doing it in the background, but let me actually do it in the document itself.
I had a quick question about these API reviews. So do we think that this is necessary to do in SIG architecture? I mean, this seems like a specific enough area that it's conceivable that we have a SIG API and these guys are like permanently immersed in API design and consistency and all of these things.
Right. So
there's so much overlap there. I mean,
yeah.
So what I would say is the audience of people who care about architectural changes care about APIs and API changes more than anything else. And so maybe it's a sub, I mean, so Quinn, like along those lines is like, it probably is more time than we would put in the regular SIG architecture things. But if we just said like, we're going to do end of release API review, proposal API review, and whatever, and make those be a little bit more formal and get the communications channels going, doing it under the aegis of SIG architecture, maybe as a subset of like.
Yeah, so I really want an official notion of sub-projects. Many SIGs have multiple sub-projects that don't all have the same participants or the same leads. SIG Network, for example, has kube proxy and ingress, and those have largely disjoint sets of people working on them at various times. Maybe now they don't, but in the past they had. SIG Apps obviously has Helm and the workload APIs, which have almost entirely disjoint.
Be more specific. I mean, my concern is that we could probably consume all of the time that this group has just reviewing APIs and niggling about.
No, SIG architecture should not review every single field change to every single API. That should definitely not be the case. We need to put enough standards and linters and whatever else in place that doesn't have to happen. I've been there before, and yeah, it just totally does not scale. It can easily consume all the time.
Yeah, I would break it into two categories. Most API changes, there's a very loose touch point, having the conventions be obvious and people knowing who to ask to go get conventions, like, is a SIG communication challenge. And then the hard stuff is the kind of thing like Joe brought up. It's like, do we want to add gRPC to the API server? Like, it's like, that's a thing that's definitely SIG architecture overlapping with the API review. And that takes a lot of time. Those are the hard PRs.
And I would also say, having, and this relates back to the KEP process, which was, something else we can discuss here. Having new APIs, not just like a field addition type of thing, but having new APIs, requires some level of formality in terms of that we have a thing that we can look at and, and discuss. And again, this is going to be one of those things where if it's part of, and I'm sorry, Brian, if it's part of core, that's that's one thing. If it's part of some sort of extended thing with a new API, that's something else entirely.
Well, so I have a concern that if we're reviewing these API changes at code freeze or something, that feels a little bit late. The horse is already out of the barn at that point. So
no.
How do we say no there?
This is the pass to catch the things that we have, and this is the focus review, which is all API changes that happen in a release need a formal, like, we should go, like, we kind of do it during release notes, but like, as the set of API changes at code freeze is the last chance to correct an API change going out. It's the double check, not the initial upfront.
Got it.
Yeah.
And I would love to see the release notes process tied into that. That'd be good.
Well, yeah, this is another area where I think feature branches would help. Especially for major API work.
Yep.
It's what's happened with, for example, with some of the workload API changes, the process to do it without feature branches is kind of painful. You end up in this situation where stuff can be half done or half baked, or what if you do decide that changes are made, they're very hard to revert after multiple PRs. So for some of these major new APIs, I think doing the work in a feature branch would facilitate this kind of gating review.
Now, are there things that we could do to actually give folks some guarantee that, hey, if you go through some of these extra steps, then there's a good chance that you're going to sail through in these later processes? And
I think the later processes are always like it's the human part of it, which is like I would kind of say it as the point of it is just to stop the thing that we can never undo, not it's the yes, we're really sorry that we didn't catch this earlier. Yes, the process broke down. Yes, that you did everything in good faith, but if you do this, we will live with this forever, and this is our last chance to catch it. We've had a couple of those. Like, it would not be like, so I think you're right. Like, it should be, if we find more than 5 things, our init process is so broken.
Exactly.
The actual end process is just telling us that we screwed up majorly, and maybe we need to pause a release or do something, or put them all back in output. Whatever.
Yeah, I have a concrete example of that. I was pulled into the storage class going to V1 this discussion at the very last minute. I'd never been involved in the alpha or beta reviews. It was just done in SIG storage. That was not cool. There was no good outcome that could come from that. Like, either would say, well, go back to the drawing board, or don't make any changes. Right?
But wait, who was involved from the API approver in that process?
Tim Hawken.
Okay, so this is one of those things where it's like there wasn't a great amount of communication even amongst the API approvers there.
Yeah, Joe. Another example that I think where I would talk about this is the issue you raised about adding new V1 Beta 2 on deployments right near the end and leaving V1 Beta 1 and then changing the defaults. Like, that's something that code freeze. We don't want to be doing it at release freeze. We want to do it at code freeze, and so this is another area where, so there was a question, also I added it to the backlog earlier, about what do we do with the architectural roadmap. So this is where I think the roadmap could really, really help. Because, for example, for the workload APIs, we actually had a roadmap. Like, in this release, we want to go to beta. In this release, we want to go to V1. If we have that sketched out for the next several releases, we know what things are on the horizon. We can actually schedule these reviews far enough in advance.
Well, I think a big part of this, though, is that, and I don't know how to deal with this because it goes beyond the API changes, but taking that example of actually moving deployment out of extensions into apps and going from V1 Beta 1 to V1 Beta 2 and stuff like that, it's not necessarily the wrong thing to do. I don't think we got all our ducks in order in terms of communicating this to people.
And it was the first time we did that too, and I think the right thing for us is to take the lessons learned and put that process in. We alpha fields and alpha annotations, that was a 2-year-long giant car crash
experiment.
Eventually we all, well, it's not your fault. I mean, it's every,
no.
Oh yeah, I should add that to my doc, by the way.
Yeah, we figured it out. It took us a really long time. We should never have that problem again, but we're probably going to have new ones. I can think
we're going to make mistakes. There's no doubt about it. I think it's just a matter of communication. But I think there's other things where it's a lot of times I find out about stuff when I'm reading the release notes for a release, right? Now, I'm not Brian. I don't actually memorize all the issue numbers because I don't think the dude sleeps, right, dude? But I think a lot of other people are it's, I think pretty much everybody finds stuff out during the release notes, and sometimes those are pretty big things.
Brian said something before that I think is really key, which is automating the gathering of the information from what we have is our best tool for managing processes that humans are fallible at. And so I would say maybe a SIG architecture goal for 110 should be, we need to work with SIG testing and SIG contrib-X to automate at least the pre-gathering of important designs, changes, and so forth, and then evaluate how that's working, and then look to revise that in future releases to get better at. We should be able to realistically generate an 80% correct list of important changes without humans being involved.
Yeah, for example, the bot already tags PRs that touch types.go files.
Right, and it tags too many today, and nobody's looking at that. But if it was SIG arc, say at the middle of a release in SIG architecture, we do a quick pass on our auto-generated list and be has everybody talked through all of these, or have we done API? Maybe we get a little bit more formal in SIG arc about calling and surfacing this up and disseminating the information. Because
okay, so I want to pause this discussion. It's been great. Can we get a volunteer to carry this forward and make a proposal, and then drive the implementation of something. Because Daniel and David and Jordan and Clayton are all here to discuss and Joe are here to discuss the webhook thing. So I would like to have some time.
I will take the to-do on that because I need to automate something that I do manually today.
Cool.
Okay. Yeah, I would sign up, but I want to spend my time trying to move the thing forward in increments. Yeah. Okay.
As a couple concrete inputs to that, Clayton, I would call out some of the linters that we have and the etcd storage test as examples of the types of things we want to see associated with any new API change, like fixtures that we can keep of every version that say this JSON and this YAML and this proto was valid at release X, and it should always be valid going forward, that we can just add to that corpus.
Yeah, we're working on 2 things in that space. One of our team members is working on an API linter. Look for a PR, I don't know, any day now. And something else Mehdi has been talking about, I don't know where it is, but he's been looking at something that makes sure that the Open API spec remains backwards compatible between versions.
Yep.
So those are 2 concrete things that we're working on.
I'll lean on API machinery for the bulk of this. I want to kind of, I'll do the quick proposal on the high level and the medium level, and then we'll come back to the group.
Cool.
I'm not sure if we really need to discuss the webhook thing. I've mostly given up on doing it the right way, and I'm thinking we should just go with our plan B at this point.
Remind me, plan B. I'm sorry, I didn't see plan B called out as such. I wasn't sure what that was.
Plan B is to retain basically the same object on the request and response path, and add the patch type to the status field.
Okay.
And hopefully, I would like to at least rename spec to request and status to response, because that makes a little bit more sense. This is as opposed to making two separate request.
Yeah, it's much closer to the existing patterns that we have today in the 3 webhooks that we have.
Yeah,
Eric
Go ahead, Brad.
Tunit dug up some history on these past discussions. Did that get posted to the PR?
Yeah.
No.
Could you do that?
Yeah, I can.
And so this is the kind of thing, if we talk about case history, the kind of thing that we should probably document, like this was discussed these 5 times and this was the outcome.
Yeah.
We should put that in API convention somewhere.
Yeah, somewhat infuriatingly, the outcome ended up what we are, but it seemed like the majority of the participants in the conversation actually wanted it to be separate request response objects.
So I was going to raise this as like a general architectural principle that I've kind of been talking to a few people about, but like we're at the point in Cube where sometimes worse is better, which is we can fix things by creating new things, but it doesn't actually make the project better. Like changing the patterns, changing the ideas. Like we talked a little bit about this in the V1, V2 APIs. Like there's a cost associated with every change we do. And I want us to at least consider that during high level design and architecture, which is sometimes it's okay to just keep doing the thing we're doing and look at evolving new things. It doesn't apply to
my number one most important principle is consistency is more important than correctness. So unless it is an important thing to change, and there's concrete value and important value that comes out of it, and we're going to sign up to eventually fix the old things, then in general, consistency is easier for client developers and users to deal with.
Yeah, that was the message I got, and why I'm assuming that we're going to go with Plan B. I do think it is wasteful to echo the request back, and so we may want to make that optional, but then you've got a weird API type thing. So
on the initial review, we actually said, like in the initial review, there was a design point put on one of the fields about as long as we spec that it might not be that the client is allowed to not fill this out in the response for various performance related reasons, and we think we can make that be sane for the implementer. Like admission's kind of a special case because there's one consumer of the admission chain, and it can be a little bit more stronger versus like the other APIs are consumed by every client in the world. And so we have to be a little bit more defensive. We might be able to make that trade-off on like the initial, like,
Yeah, that's
as the pure spec goes as well. The objects are already optional because they don't get set on delete. So a delete admission hook doesn't actually include existing objects.
And actually, we can optimize that too, Dan, by, if necessary, we can omit that from deserialization with a specialized object.
Okay, so can I get someone to actually add a section about these hook APIs to the API conventions that captures this?
Yeah, I did a fair amount of spelunking when Daniel and I were talking, so I'll try to gather the discussions and write up something.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I think would be worthwhile as we talk about sort of what are our conventions around webhooks, and this in some ways goes beyond this, is how do you register webhooks? What is the twisty maze of TLS certificates? Can we rationalize that stuff, right? Because as we add more and more webhooks, getting some consistency there might be helpful also. And so that looks beyond the API to sort of what is the experience for as people actually go ahead and use these things.
So we have two different use cases for hooks today, right? There are single hooks called from single places, right? Those are things like authentication, authorization, and image review webhooks today, right? And then we have a net new kind of hook for admission. And the admission hook is one where the configuration about where to connect is shared amongst all API servers instead of being targeted at a specific one. In all those cases, in the case of point-to-point, where it was single call or single destination, we had used a kubeconfig file because it described how to connect to a place and how to authenticate to a place. We have had discussions about changing that format to reflect some things that Daniel wanted.
I want to suggest that maybe if we do this topic justice, it will take up more than the time allotted to the.
That's bigger than the margin.
That's
probably
like
true. 1% through the.
I will say, Joe, that there has been some thought, and I guess that when we need to.
Probably worth writing up. And again,
that's essentially what I'm saying. Is that it's one of these things where it's like the kubeconfig file for this stuff. Like number one, there are some webhooks that actually don't use the kubeconfig file and actually have explicit flags around.
Connection information? I don't think so. I think all the ones I'm aware of take a kubeconfig for connection. And again, kubeconfig as a wrapper for connection data was a struct that fit the purpose, but arguably could be tweaked. I think more interesting is the considerations around the topology of the hook. Is it a one-to-one? Is it a many-to-one type of thing? Do we need to be able to support targeting a URL or a service? That type of thing that would affect the way you would spec out that information.
And as I recall, Daniel had someone or knew someone who was interested in seeing about making like a V2 of how to describe how to connect to a hook. So it is going to come up again.
Yeah. And as we do that, I think the types of information that we were talking about for the authorization hook in particular seem very applicable to general hooks. Like what are the versions in and out? What's the connection information? Are you targeting URL or a service? Those don't seem specific to one particular hook. That's a kind of general set of things you need to answer.
Yeah. And that's essentially my point. I don't think we necessarily need to come to a decision right here. I think it's just a matter of like when we think about documenting API conventions, and we got to look beyond just sort of like what is the stuff on the wire to what is the experience for how we configure this stuff. But
Daniel, I can't hear you. If you're Daniel, you look like you're talking very loud. you're oh wow, this is cool. No, sorry. There? Oh no, it's Joe.
Daniel, perhaps you could like get a whiteboard and then write everything out on it. And the whole
I would like it. It's charades. He can act out the API. So I think he's going to have a webhook on one side, and then he's going to have his other hand waving, maybe with a sock puppet. He's got kids.
He could literally dance about architecture.
interpretive architecture dance?
No, sorry, Daniel.
Okay, I added some links to some of the past discussions that Eric sent to the doc, to the agenda notes.
And I think this is a pattern itself also, is that like there's these past discussions. Those aren't very accessible to a lot of people who haven't sort of lived through it and have those battle scars. And at some point, those past discussions need to be boiled down to something that's more accessible to a wider audience. And
Yeah,
so,
I don't actually have all the numbers memorized. I do remember the terms used to discuss them. Which
so you can always look them up. Okay. No, I'm pretty sure that you have like a what is it, a
big dictionary in my brain.
And the Bloom filter set up. Any issue that matches these 3 keywords has to be it.
Okay, so so you mentioned the gRPC for the
yeah, I mean that it's obviously a different beast. It's just it's yet another thing, right?
Is there anyone here who can speak to that? Daniel, you were somewhat aware of the KMS.
So I'm aware of the use case. I'm not. Daniel might have been involved in the discussion.
I think the design write-up was modeled after the CNI, CRI types of hooks that the node was building, and from I think the perspective was that this is a high performance sort of internal storage focused extension point, and we're not really
for example.
we're not really expecting this to be like hitting some remote service on every detail.
And I'm sympathetic to that. I just think it's like yet another new type of thing from the APIs.
So I would say one thing which I think is useful is at some point, like I don't think as we continue to evolve Cube, I could imagine at some point us defining gRPC equivalents for many of the hook points we have if gRPC continues to be successful, and we would adapt and say, like, I don't see any reason why at some point the webhook admission channel couldn't do gRPC calls in addition to webhook based on a setting. We don't have to talk about it now.
So I just want to throw out there that the gRPC team sits in our building now. So if there are specific asks of them, and we report to the same VP now. So if there are specific asks of them, please send them our way. I'm pushing right now to figure out whether some of our API patterns are actually supportable. Not clear that they are.
Yeah, and like Daniel did the doc. I'll say everything that I know Daniel wants to say. So Daniel did the doc about the upfront questions on gRPC. There's certainly an option that we could generate, like we do otherwise, a gRPC schema for our API from our core API docs. It would not be gRPC-like, but it might be good enough to work. So there's, I guess, like one of the things I would say is that the physical upfront cost of every new API for declarative config is a very key thing. Like our user-facing API is somewhat distinct from our downward APIs.
Yes.
CRI, CNI are clearly downward APIs. KMS is clearly a downward API. Webhook sits on the edge. I have noticed, as we've talked about webhook extensions, so there's an ongoing discussion in SIG API machinery about and Daniel, this is another thing that Daniel cares about. I'm just going to read Daniel's mind and pull it out, which was when David and I and Mike have been going and prototyping like webhook authorizers, webhook extensions, we want to reuse our existing machinery to do that. Mm-hmm. The problem is then those are now exposed in the upward discovery API. Like if we treat them like API objects, we get a whole bunch of things for free. We have our framework in place, we have discovery, but now they start showing up to end users. And they're not really intended for consumers of the system. They're downward, not upward. And so in some cases, it might have actually been easier to do gRPC webhook, gRPC authorization webhook, gRPC admission webhook, gRPC whatever, because at least it offers us a set of tools. It's a little bit less friendly to clients. And that's kind of the distinction between downward and upward, is if you're a downward API.
Can we use some of the APIs dual purpose? Like some of the hook APIs, we can also use it for asking, can I do this?
Yeah, we do that today. So the same APIs that like a subject access review, the API server can answer that, and that's how the kubelet delegates authorization decisions to the API server today. But then that can also be outward facing to some hook that's served based on whatever that thing wants to serve. It's the same type of format.
Clear case where it has to follow the API conventions.
Right. And I might say, as a high-level thought experiment, if you're downward and you're looking to build something that's not user-facing, the first place you should start is gRPC, because it's something we're doing already. It provides easy integration. It's got good clients.
Particularly if it's imperative and procedural rather than declarative.
And if you're looking at declarative, you should start from the API, and the middle ground is where we need to sort out that.
So I also think, though, you talk about reusing the API machinery for doing some of this stuff. I think there's other machinery that we need to take into consideration. And this is things like our sort of proto-SDK, where the SDK is client Go, how does that relate to this? What is our documentation around this? How do we, and it's a different audience, right? I mean, it's like sometimes you'll have the SDK, like this is my Microsoft showing, there's the SDK and then there's the EDK and then they have a file system SDK, and there's different SDKs for different sort of audiences and developers, and there's conventions. But we need to think in terms of sort of like, hey, this API is in this group, so it's actually going to be part of this sort of experience. And we need to think through the documentation and the experience of that also. We can't ignore that.
And we don't have any API conventions established for the RPC style.
Exactly.
So this is why I pushed back on this in the cloud provider discussion originally.
I will say it's kind of funny because we talk about gRPC as high performance. I'm pretty sure our actual API is faster than gRPC right now, based on some of the other tests I've seen. Because we actually—
That's a convenient truth, Clayton.
It is unfortunate, and like I've watched the Cockroach DB guys struggle. Like gRPC isn't perfect yet, and I want to see gRPC get better. Ideally, at some point, we need to stop. And Daniel and I talked about this. He'd love to talk about this. Is like, at some point, we are building a microservices framework for our upward-facing things, and we need to be cautious about how far we go down that, because there is a level of the glue, like we talked about this in a previous call with auth and services and certificates and the API server talking to backends. We are talking about building out things that are basically microservices frameworks for our specific cases. And there are other projects and tools out there that are trying to solve this problem generally for Kubernetes. We haven't yet had to do hard decisions there, but like Spiffy and Istio are both examples of, we're reinventing specific solutions to generic solutions those would like to provide. How do we mentally organize the investment we make in, doing this API extension to backend logic versus, let's saying, you know what? At some point, you should just install Istio, and that's your problem, and we'll have a recommended path to do that. If you want to do identity, you should install Spire or whatever. Like those kinds of things. We're not there yet, but we're starting.
Yeah,
and there's a point in time thing. Like Mike was doing all the stuff around the certificate stuff. I knew there was a huge amount of overlap between that and the Spiffy stuff, but Spiffy wasn't there yet. So what are you going to say? Don't do it, right? But like,
and actually that intervention, Joe, I think productively has led to Container Identity talking about this as the things that Mike is kind of looking at now is a very concrete way of taking something that is in-cube coupled, moving it and using the extensions, generating feedback, taking the hit, and then working with the other projects to take their use cases. And so that if it's extensible for this core thing that just has to gradually transform, it also, and so like we'll stop and say, this is a Spire problem now, drop and replace. So that actually did come to is it going in the right direction?
I think we're getting there, but it's painful, right? And I just want to be sympathetic. Yeah. Okay.
So I want to time box this. I will try to come to an upcoming API machinery meeting to discuss some of the longer term things that is coming up on our side as well, especially as we work with the Istio folks and the gRPC folks. But so far our investigations show that our machinery has been kind of optimized for the declarative patterns, much more so than the other mechanisms. Anyway, I do want to get to the KEP process. Just quickly though, because I hope it's quick and I will insist that it's quick. There was a question about the architectural roadmap. Who added that to the agenda?
I did because we have an open issue on it.
Okay. Yeah, so I recently, I'd signed up at a previous meeting to collect the set of efforts, and I guess one came up in this meeting that's important about how we add fields to the API that I should add to that. The intent of this is actually more of a roadmap than my original roadmap doc that Clayton, Tim, and I put together. And basically the intent is to make it clear what directions the project as a whole is headed architecturally, organizationally, code-wise, and try to put some stakes in the ground about milestones we want to hit to get people rowing in the same direction. So I think it needs to be fleshed out a little bit more. We will want to publish it and ask for input from various SIGs. We are trying to staff parts of it on our side. I would like to get help. I don't think there's a lot of controversy anymore on most of the things that we're doing. Pretty much everything in that doc is underway anyway already. I sent out the data from DevStats that shows the only increases to velocity of the project have come from adding repos, and part of that is due to GitHub issues like problems with ACLs, notifications, testing, and all kinds of other things being at the repo granularity. But some of it is definitely also due to ownership, approver and reviewer ownership, and bottlenecks in processes there. Yeah, I mean, pretty much we're at a point where everything net new that we're adding, component-wise particularly, needs to go into a separate repo, not into Kubernetes. And I would even like to start down the path of using feature branches and the recent changes SIG testing made to move everything to a single project, so we don't need to spin up new projects for new release branches and things like that. Gives us most of what we need to be able to add branch tests just via PR to the test info repo. So I mean, definitely the multi-repo and feature branch stuff is not the only thing in that doc. There are a lot of extension points and other changes being made that are in there. But making it clear, for example, that we are trying to detangle kube control dependencies, that we're trying to make version skew actually work. And these are important things for people to be aware of, so we don't continue to increase debt in areas where we're actively trying to reduce it.
Sure, and I actually had added to this, like, what are we going to produce and how are we going to communicate it to whom? And I think that's an important thing. You talked about staffing, and I know that comes in for maybe a handful of companies here, but in a typical week for Kubernetes itself, Kubernetes, there are people from like 90 some different companies who contribute, and that's just the average. There's a lot of people across this community at a lot of different companies, and then there's people not associated with companies. And so the question is how do we help lead them, help them have a picture of what's going on in a way? They're not all going to go read long documents. They want to be able to visualize and very quickly understand. And so how do we produce something that helps them go, okay, this is what we should do, this is where we're going, and then help communicate that out so it's in a manner that can be consumed by the masses rather than a handful. And here I'm just talking about the contributors, not even the masses beyond that, just the contributors.
Well, yeah, and this is maybe more. Sorry, Jace, did you have something to say?
I was just going to say that this is one of those classic things that when you try and simplify it to make it easy to consume, you are sacrificing maybe the spirit of what it's trying to accomplish in the first place. Like, there's only so much simplification you can do around this complex surgical removal of technical debt and some of these implementations. So if this is going to be led, I am 100% in agreement that it needs to be staffed with people who are the lead surgeons, and then there's some sort of delegation effort that people can apply their efforts to as sub-projects, but not like
maybe we just don't know how to do this, but we have been trying to do this for 4 years, and I have to say my experience is that more than 90% of the contributors drop off and don't sustain. So there's a huge churn cost for explaining these complex issues and trying to ramp people up. And even in cases where we initially thought, some contributor who was doing it part-time was going to be able to step up and make a concerted effort and, get their PRs through, which basically requires not just time on Friday nights, but every day of the week to keep things moving forward with the level of pace of this project. Realistically, it has to be people working full-time, whether they're working for a company or not. Like Justin Santa Barbara, I think, is maybe the unique example of someone who's kind of works for himself to some degree, who's made major contributions to the project. But we do have over 100 people who are paid to work on Kubernetes, not just Google and Red Hat, but at a number of companies now, and companies are coming on board like IBM, who want to contribute, and ramping up those people is definitely hard. They come from very other maybe seemingly related projects, but with very different technical conventions, and it's just time consuming to ramp them up on the nitty gritty.
So to understand the architectural roadmap right now, because I've been trying to read through your documents, it's somewhere between like 50 and 100 pages of Google Docs. That's not discoverable. And a lot of people I've talked to who are, full-time on this, or a good chunk of time on this, said, I'm not going to go read those. It's not consumable to expect people to get into these docs, and they just say they're not going to. And so that's why I say, who are we going to communicate, and how are we going to communicate this to? Because in its current form in Google Docs, which I have to go through my recent history to try and discover, I can't use a Google search or link off someplace. I got to go back into my history and find. It makes it difficult to communicate these things out to a broad audience. And that makes it hard to kind of lead people and help them have a common picture. And so that's where I'm looking at it from, is actually leading and communicating.
Google Docs need to be converted to Markdown. I have scarce little time to do that. I am going to try to somehow find time to do that. But honestly, in order to find time to do that, I'm going to need to do things like skip community meetings, right? So
I don't think you need to do that, Brian. Anybody could do that. I'd be happy to take that off your hands if you want to.
Oh, that would be awesome.
To take a 20-page Google Doc and turn that into Markdown, do we think now that's going to become readable by folks? I don't know that communicates clearly with people that they're going to sit and read through.
So Matt, I think the comment was made earlier that there is a certain amount of detail that is required, and the only way I can think of getting around that is to have an executive summary at the top. If you don't want to read this whole thing, but you want a vague idea of all the content, read the executive summary. But it's by definition not going to cover all the required material. And if you want the required material, you read the other 20 pages.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to come up with a way to communicate it, and it isn't working. And so being able to, that's one of the reasons there's been talk of diagrams and things like that, because you can speak a lot in a picture, and it doesn't give you all the minute details. It doesn't link off to all the issues, but it helps people understand general pictures of where we're going and what we mean.
Yeah, I think diagrams and slide decks are a good way. So more presentations, maybe?
There's a certain amount of
discoverable
that happens there, though, and that's the thing. To some degree, we need editors, right? We need people who actually, remove stuff without removing stuff, and it's that's what good editing can do. And I think
in this case, you need
skill, and it takes time. Yeah,
you need editors who understand the content. So
right, it's a very tall bar, right?
So Quentin could do it, but Quentin could do it, but Devin couldn't do it, for example.
I know, right? Believe me, there's a part of me that's I want to go up to a mountain retreat and become a hermit and write nothing but documentation, because I just know that there's a huge need there, unfortunately.
I just read that architectural roadmap. I think it's called document, the 20-odd page one, I think, or 17 pages. I happen to think that it's an extremely good document. It's clearly a bit rough around the edges, and it could probably be abbreviated by 30% or something like that. But there's a limit to how much you can throw away without losing critical information.
And at this point, that was written in April, March and April. It probably needs to be updated. Maybe you should make another pass on it in January.
Sure, but let's just get it into MD and get it linked in the right place. So when you go to SIG architecture, you get a link directly to this is our current thinking on architecture, and by all means we can update it every however often we think. but let's get it out there rather than in some kind of like.
Yeah, I'm happy with that. My executive summary was architecture.md, and this is getting down to the what is Kubernetes topic. I've tried to summarize it a couple of times. Architecture.md is more about where we are than where we're going. Maybe we could write a similar summary about where we're going that just has.
I can take yours, well, your and Clayton and Tim's 17-page thing and just turn it into MD, and then add a very brief thing at the beginning, which could either be a link to existing material if there is suitable material, or just a half-page summary of the 17-page document. And then we can iterate and like edit it and send it to somebody.
That sounds good. I mean, partly it's part of the reason it wasn't concise also is that there was a discovery process as part of writing it.
Sure. No, and I don't think it's terrible. Don't get me wrong. All I'm saying is, agreeing with Joe that, somebody really good at this could probably condense it a bit, but not like a huge amount of it.
Well, I think the thing to keep in mind is that good editing not only condenses, but it also structures it in a way that's more consumable, easier to scan, easier to actually, grok, right? So, and it's a skill, right? And I think, it's like, going through the process of writing the book, you see, I saw some of this stuff actually come through, right? And actually viewing it as a product is a thing in and of itself.
Okay, so
Yeah,
I want to.
I was just going to say,
Sorry.
Brian, to jump on one thing real quick. You talked about slide decks and other communications. The way that we use to maybe create and brainstorm and collect stuff together isn't necessarily the best way to also share it with the masses. And so to expect dual purpose out of something may end up being a little too much sometimes. And so there's no criticism on what's there. It's just now saying for a different purpose of going to communicate with a bunch of people, maybe there's a way to like get them focused and to consume it more easily. That's all I was trying to get at.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I mean, mostly my aim was to, with these docs, was to sort of figure out for myself what we thought we should do and put it into one place that I could point at and at least have other people who are somewhat informed to be able to read that and agree or disagree. I agree that it was not targeted at communicating to the masses, and that really shows. So anyway, we have 5 minutes left. I did want to get to the KEP process. Changes, thank you for writing the summary there, Joe. I will try to go and finish the review of that today. The changes seem to be, are there any major changes? It's just structural, right?
No, I think it is actually a pretty major update of the template in terms of the names of the sections. I think the feedback from Tim was really like, wow, we're using a lot of specialized terminology here, which may make a ton of sense in the Rust community, but it's very alien to folks.
Yeah, and that was my feedback before as well. Like, we have an approval process, but it didn't call it that, right? Or we have a review process, but it didn't call it that.
I'm trying to remember. Like, I can look at the changes, the previous version, but you look at some of the. But basically, what it is like, what's the scope? What's the proposal? And let's talk about the proposal both in terms of the nitty-gritty details, but like user stories of like, I was able to do this, now I can do that. Let's encourage people to think about that. And then a section around sort of risks and mitigation. Specifically, I called out security and what is the impact that this change could have on the larger ecosystem of how Kubernetes is used and used and developed, right? Because I think, everything we do has ripples, right? So what are the ripples of this thing? Hopefully it's not super controversial. I think it'll maybe make this thing a little bit more approachable. The next thing on my list is, this is the template that was updated based on, I want to go back and there's the buddy document to that, which is documenting the process. That really needs some help also. And I also want to prioritize getting some sort of like Hugo-like site up or something like that actually sort of makes these things cross-linked and searchable and indexed, because I think that, we need to plan for scale around these things, and discoverability and being able to view and read these things in a reasonable way is going to be a big part of that.
Okay, yeah, so in terms of testing it on a few more proposals, do you think we're ready to do that? Could you present at a community meeting, and we can maybe get some ideas about some SIGs that could try it out, and then we could go to those SIGs and ask about what proposals are on the horizon for 110? And
I mean, practically, I don't think I can do it pre-KubeCon.
Yeah.
Just the amount of stuff on my plate, because I got reInvent there also, which you get.
KubeCon, yeah. KubeCon presentations are due next week. Slides are due on the 20th.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to make that deadline. I'm just being brutally honest.
So by the way, my KubeCon talk is going to be on architecture. So I'm trying to, that's why I pushed on the diagram. So thanks for the starting point, Matt. But yes, I'm not close to done yet.
But I would love to get to the point sometime very soon after KubeCon, even though we're going to be in the midst of December, to at least get that process out, get something where it's like, we really want people to use this thing. If you use it, you get priority for getting a lot of eyes on it. We'll get to the point where, we can't make decisions completely binding yet, but like, you're going to have a lot of air cover if you actually go through this process, that you're not going to get surprised. And then we can beat the drum sort of beginning of next year as everybody gets re-engaged.
Okay, yeah. So speaking of which, with only a couple of minutes left, the year all along. So I am going to be out mostly until the week of January 8th.
So you broke up there a little bit for me in the beginning there, Brian.
Yeah,
what
I
was
missed
that?
it.
Yeah, I'm gonna be out between KubeCon and vacation. I'm gonna be out most of the rest of the year until January 8th. So my recommendation would be push ahead on the things that are in flight, like the KEP process, writing up some of the details we discussed today. I actually have a list of design principles from conversations that I want to get written down. Maybe I'll do that when I'm on vacation. But certainly feel free to meet without me. I do strongly recommend putting together an agenda ahead of time and trying to stick to it. I think we made some good progress today. Yeah. So thanks everybody for today's discussion. I think it was pretty constructive.
Hey, Brian, enjoy your vacation. Try not to work.
I will try.
If you come back and you can't remember issue numbers, that's a good sign.
It is. It really is.
Just start by limiting yourself to 6 to 8 hours a day. That'll help.
Change it loud.
Yeah, there you go. Okay.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks.